Her stepmother gave her Blackthorn Manor because she believed it was worthless. A leaking roof, dead gardens, 40 years of dust. Eleanor Vale accepted it because she had nowhere else to go. 3 weeks after her father's funeral, she stood in the drawing room of the Vale townhouse while Margaret Vale divided what remained of the family estate with the precision of a banker settling accounts. The London house went to Margaret. The investments went to Margaret. The profitable farmland in Kent would be managed on behalf of Margaret's son, Charles. Eleanor received Blackthorn Manor. Margaret slid the deed across the polished table and smiled. "You always did enjoy old things." Charles gave a quiet laugh from beside the fireplace. Eleanor looked down at the parchment. She knew the name. Everyone in the Vale family did. Blackthorn stood nearly 60 miles north, beyond the market town of Ashbourne, on land that had once belonged to her father's mother. The manor had been closed before Eleanor was born. No tenant had lived there in decades. No member of the family spoke about it unless forced. As a child, Eleanor had once asked her father why. He had gone silent. Then he had told her never to mention Blackthorn again. Now it was hers. "You could sell the land," Margaret said, "assuming anyone wants it." Eleanor folded the deed. "What is it worth?" Margaret's smile widened. "Less than the roof repairs." That was how Eleanor understood what the gift truly was. Not generosity, a punishment. Margaret had taken everything valuable and left Eleanor with something designed to consume whatever little money she had left. But Eleanor refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing fear. "When do I take possession?" Charles turned toward her. "You're actually going there?" "Yes." "In December?" "Yes." Margaret studied her for several seconds. Then, strangely, the amusement disappeared from her face. "You needn't stay there." It was the first thing she had said that sounded almost like concern. Eleanor noticed. "I thought you wanted me gone." "I want you sensible." "Then perhaps you should have left me something sensible." Margaret's jaw tightened. Eleanor picked up her gloves. "I leave tomorrow." She expected another insult. Instead, Margaret said quietly, "Stay out of the West Wing." Eleanor stopped. Charles looked sharply at his mother. Margaret immediately reached for her tea. "The floorboards are unsafe," she added. Eleanor said nothing, but she remembered the warning. 2 days later, Blackthorn Manor appeared through the snow. The house stood at the end of a long avenue of dead elms, its gray stone walls rising from the winter landscape like the remains of a forgotten fortress. Several windows were boarded shut. Ivy covered the eastern tower. One chimney leaned at an angle that looked impossible. Yet the manor was larger than Eleanor had imagined, much larger. She stepped down from the hired carriage with one suitcase, a wooden trunk, and 32 pounds to her name. The driver stared at the house. "You certain, miss?" "No." He waited. Eleanor almost smiled. "But I'm staying." The man unloaded her trunk with unusual speed. Before leaving, he pointed toward a stone cottage near the edge of the property. "Old Mr. Finch lives there. Looks after the place when he can." "When he can?" The driver climbed back onto his seat. "He doesn't come near the house after dark." Eleanor looked at him. "Why?" But he had already flicked the reins. The carriage disappeared down the avenue. For the first time, Eleanor was alone. The front door resisted her shoulder before finally opening with a groan. Cold air rolled from the entrance hall. Dust covered the black and white tiles. White sheets draped the furniture. A chandelier hung above her like a frozen spider. Eleanor set down her suitcase. "Home," she whispered. Her voice echoed into darkness. She spent the afternoon opening shutters and searching for a room with an intact fireplace. She found one on the ground floor overlooking the dead rose garden. By sunset, she had managed to start a weak fire and boil water in a soot-blackened kettle left in the kitchen. The manor groaned around her as the temperature dropped. Wind pressed against the windows. Rain replaced the snow shortly after midnight. Then the storm arrived. Eleanor woke to thunder. A violent gust struck the western side of the house. Something crashed upstairs. She sat upright. Another crash followed, this one louder. Eleanor pulled on her coat, lit a lamp, and climbed the main staircase. The western corridor was darker than the rest of the manor. Most of its doors were locked. The wallpaper hung in strips. At the far end, rainwater ran down the wall. She remembered Margaret's warning, "Stay out of the west wing." Then lightning flashed through a broken window. A section of plaster collapsed. Eleanor shielded her face as dust filled the corridor. When it cleared, she raised the lamp. Behind the fallen plaster was brickwork. But the bricks did not belong to the wall. They formed a rough rectangle. Eleanor stepped closer. Her heartbeat changed. There was something behind them. She set down the lamp and touched the mortar. It crumbled beneath her fingers. The wall had not been built to support the house. It had been built to hide something. For nearly an hour, Eleanor worked with an iron poker from one of the bedrooms. One brick came loose, then another. Cold, stale air slipped through the opening. By the time she removed enough bricks to squeeze through, her hands were bleeding. She lifted the lamp. A wooden door stood behind the wall. Its brass handle was black with age. Eleanor turned it. The door opened. The room beyond had been sealed so completely that nothing inside appeared to have moved in decades. A woman's dark green coat hung beside the fireplace. A porcelain cup sat on a small table. A clock had stopped at 17 minutes past 9. Books lined one wall, and beneath the window stood a writing desk. Eleanor approached it slowly. Dozens of envelopes covered the surface, all sealed, all yellowed with age. Then she saw the envelope resting above the others. Her lamp trembled. Written across the front in faded black ink were 2 words, Eleanor Vale. She stared at her own name. Then she noticed the date beneath it, December 1846. Eleanor was born in 1874. The letter had been written 28 years before she existed. Behind her, somewhere beyond the hidden doorway, a floorboard creaked. Eleanor turned. Someone was standing in the corridor. Eleanor lifted the lamp higher. The figure did not move. For one terrible second, she thought the stories about Blackthorn Manor had been true after all. Then the man stepped into the light. He was elderly, thin, and wrapped in a heavy brown coat shiny with age. Snow clung to his boots, and rain darkened the shoulders of his coat. A gray beard covered most of his face. Eleanor tightened her grip on the iron poker. "Who are you?" The man looked past her, toward the open room. His expression changed instantly. Not surprise, fear. "What have you done?" Eleanor stepped between him and the doorway. "I asked who you are." "Thomas Finch." The name clicked into place. "The caretaker from the stone cottage. You could have knocked." "I did. I heard nothing." Storm swallowed it. His eyes returned to the hidden room. "You opened it." The wall collapsed. "That wall has stood 40 years. Apparently not well enough." Finch moved closer. Eleanor raised the poker. He stopped. "I'm not here to hurt you, Miss Vale. You know who I am? I knew your father." That answer unsettled her more than anything else. Eleanor lowered the poker only slightly. "Then perhaps you can explain why there is a letter in that room, addressed to me 28 years before I was born." Finch went completely still. "You found the letters?" "Yes." "How many?" "Dozens." "Did you open any?" "Not yet." Relief crossed his face. That decided it. Eleanor turned back toward the desk. Finch caught her arm. "Don't." She looked down at his hand. He released her immediately. "Forgive me. Why shouldn't I read a letter with my own name on it?" "Because that room destroyed enough lives already." Eleanor stared at him. "That is not an answer." "No." "Then give me one." Finch looked older suddenly. He entered the room as though crossing the threshold required courage. His gaze moved over the untouched objects, the green coat, the cup, the clock. Finally the desk. "I haven't seen this room since I was 16. Eleanor followed. "You were here?" "I worked in the stables. My father was groundskeeper. Who lived in this room? Finch did not answer. Eleanor reached for the envelope. His voice stopped her. Lady Beatrice Vale. Eleanor frowned. My grandmother? Finch nodded. Eleanor knew almost nothing about her father's mother. Beatrice had died long before Eleanor's birth. Her father had kept only one portrait of her in the London house, and even that had eventually disappeared. She died in 1846, Eleanor said. So the family claimed. The room suddenly seemed colder. What does that mean? Finch looked toward the bricked doorway. It means you were not brought here by accident. Eleanor almost laughed. My stepmother gave me this place because it was worthless. Did she? She made that perfectly clear. Finch shook his head. Margaret Vale has wanted Blackthorn Manor for years. Eleanor stared at him. That makes no sense. She asked your father to sell it 3 times. How would you know? Because he came here after each argument. Eleanor's breath caught. My father came here? Every winter. He told me this house had been closed since before I was born. To you, perhaps. Finch reached beneath his coat and removed an old leather notebook. He made me keep records. Eleanor took it. The first pages contained repair expenses, dates, and supplies. Then she found her father's name, Edmund Vale. Beside it were dates stretching back nearly 20 years. Her father had visited Blackthorn again and again. Sometimes for a single night, sometimes for weeks. Eleanor looked up. Why? Finch's gaze drifted toward the letters. He was trying to prove something. What? That his mother had not died insane. Eleanor felt a chill crawl across her skin. Finch continued. Beatrice discovered something about the Vale estate, something involving land, money, and a second inheritance. What second inheritance? I never knew. Then why seal the room? Your grandfather ordered it. Eleanor looked around. He bricked his own wife's room shut? After she disappeared. The words hung between them. You said the family claimed she died. They held a funeral. But there was no body. Thunder rolled beyond the windows. Eleanor looked again at the envelope bearing her name. Now it felt less like an impossibility, more like a message deliberately waiting for her. She broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was elegant but hurried. Eleanor read the first line aloud. To the daughter, who will one day carry my name. She stopped. Finch whispered, Dear God. Eleanor continued silently. The letter spoke not to her specifically, but to a future granddaughter, a girl Beatrice believed would someday inherit Blackthorn. At the bottom of the page was one final instruction. If you are reading this, the lie survived me. Do not trust the Vale family records. Begin beneath the chapel floor. Eleanor read it twice. Then a sound came from somewhere below them. Not thunder, glass breaking. Finch extinguished Eleanor's lamp. Darkness swallowed the room. What are you doing? She whispered. He placed one finger against his lips. From the floor beneath them came another sound. A door opening. Then footsteps, slow, measured. Someone else had entered Blackthorn Manor, and whoever it was had come during a storm, in the middle of the night, only minutes after Eleanor opened a room that had been hidden for 40 years. Finch reached for Eleanor's wrist in the darkness. Stay here. She pulled away. If someone has broken into my house, I'm not hiding in a sealed room. Miss Vale. But Eleanor was already moving. She stepped through the opening in the wall and into the corridor, holding the iron poker in one hand and the extinguished lamp in the other. Finch followed with a muttered curse. The storm shook the windows. Somewhere below, a floorboard groaned. Then another. Eleanor descended the staircase slowly. The entrance hall appeared empty. Moonlight flashed through the tall windows whenever lightning crossed the sky. The front door stood closed. But one of the panes beside it had been broken. Rain blew across the floor. Finch crouched near the glass. Someone reached through and lifted the latch. Then locked it again? He looked toward the rear of the house. They don't want us following. Eleanor's pulse quickened. A faint sound came from the eastern corridor. A door closing. She ran. "Miss Vale!" Finch hurried after her. The corridor led through an old dining room and into a narrow passage Eleanor had not explored that afternoon. At the end stood a wooden door. It swung slightly in the wind. Beyond it was the courtyard. Footprints crossed the fresh snow. One set, large boots. They led away from the manor toward a low stone building half hidden behind yew trees. Finch stopped. The chapel. Eleanor looked at him. Beatrice's letter came back to her. Begin beneath the chapel floor. The intruder already knew. They crossed the courtyard. The chapel door was open. Inside, rows of rotting pews faced a small stone altar. The roof had partially collapsed near the rear, allowing snow to gather across the floor. The boot prints continued down the center aisle, then disappeared beside the altar. Eleanor raised the lamp. Its flame caught after several attempts. She saw scratches in the stone. Fresh scratches. Finch knelt. One of these slabs has been moved. Together, they pushed aside an old wooden kneeler. Beneath it was a rectangular stone different from the rest. An iron ring had been set into its surface. Eleanor gripped it. Finch caught her shoulder. "We don't know what's under there. That didn't stop whoever came before us." She pulled. The stone lifted surprisingly easily. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Cold air rose from below. Eleanor held the lamp over the opening. There were wet footprints on the steps. The intruder was still somewhere beneath the chapel. Finch whispered, "We should wait until morning, and give him time to take whatever my grandmother hid." Eleanor started down. The staircase ended in a small stone chamber. Shelves covered the walls. Most were empty. One wooden chest stood open in the center of the room. Papers had been scattered across the floor. Someone had searched them hastily. Eleanor picked up the nearest document, a land deed. She recognized the Vale family seal. Another document lay beneath it, then another. Names, property lines, transfer dates. Finch picked up a ledger. His expression hardened. "These are old tenancy records." "Why hide tenancy records?" "Because they don't match the official ones." Eleanor looked at him. He turned several pages. "Your grandfather's records claim 23 tenant farms were sold in 1845. And? These say they were never sold." A sound came from the far wall. Eleanor spun around. There. A narrow wooden door she had not noticed before was closing. She ran toward it. By the time she reached the passage beyond, the intruder was already disappearing around a corner. "Stop!" He did not. Eleanor followed. The passage was barely wide enough for one person. It sloped downward before emerging behind the chapel into the trees. She burst outside. A man was running toward the northern wall of the estate. Dark coat, black hat, tall. He mounted a waiting horse. Eleanor saw his face for only a second when he looked back. Lightning illuminated him. She did not recognize him, but Finch did. He stopped dead beside her. "No." The rider vanished into the storm. Eleanor turned. "You know him." Finch's face had lost all color. "That man worked for your stepmother." Eleanor stared at the empty road. "What is his name?" "Daniel Mercer." "What does he do?" Finch hesitated, then answered. "He finds things Margaret Vale once found." Back inside the chapel chamber, Eleanor began gathering the scattered papers. One document had been torn nearly in half. Another was missing its first page. Mercer had taken something, but not everything. Near the bottom of the chest, Eleanor found a leather folder tied with blue ribbon. Across the front, in Beatrice's handwriting, were the words, "The Blackthorn Trust." Eleanor opened it. The first document was dated March 1846. The second carried the signature of her grandmother. The third contained a name Eleanor had never seen before. Eleanor Beatrice Harcourt. Her hands went cold. That was my grandmother's maiden name. Finch nodded slowly. Eleanor turned the page. A single paragraph had been underlined twice. She read it, then read it again. Blackthorn Manor had never legally belonged to the Vale family. It belonged to Beatrice, and according to the trust she had created shortly before her disappearance, ownership was to pass through the female line, not to Edmund Vale, not to Margaret, not to Charles, to Beatrice's granddaughter, Eleanor. She looked up. My stepmother knew. Finch did not answer. She knew this house wasn't worthless. Yes. Then why give it to me? That was the question neither of them could explain, until Eleanor noticed the final page. A clause had been added beneath Beatrice's signature. If no legitimate female heir claimed Blackthorn before the 40-year anniversary of Beatrice Harcourt Vale's disappearance, the entire estate, and every asset attached to the Blackthorn Trust, would revert to the senior male Vale heir. Eleanor stared at the date. December 1846. Then at the present year, 1886, 40 years, Finch whispered. How long until the anniversary? Eleanor calculated. Her stomach tightened. 6 days. Someone had not given her Blackthorn Manor because it was worthless. Someone had sent her there because a clock was about to run out. And if Eleanor failed to uncover the truth within 6 days, whatever Beatrice had hidden would belong to Charles forever. By dawn, Eleanor had not slept. She sat at the long kitchen table, with Beatrice's papers spread before her, while Finch fed logs into the range. The storm had passed, leaving Blackthorn buried beneath fresh snow. 6 days. That was all she had. Eleanor read the trust again. Blackthorn Manor itself was only part of the inheritance. The document referred repeatedly to properties, accounts, mineral interests, rents, and securities held under the Blackthorn Trust. But nowhere did it list their value. What exactly did my grandmother own? Eleanor asked. Finch shook his head. More than this house. How much more? I was a stable boy, Miss Vale. You have lived here your entire life, and learned that people who ask too many questions about the Vale family rarely enjoy the answers. Eleanor looked at him. Is that why my father kept coming back? Finch stopped feeding the fire. Yes. He knew about the trust. Not at first. When did he discover it? About 15 years ago. Eleanor frowned. Then why didn't he tell me? Finch stared into the flames. Because he never found the original registry. Eleanor looked down at the documents. This is the original. No. That establishes the trust. It does not establish everything placed inside it. What does? A schedule of assets. Where is it? Missing. Eleanor understood immediately. Without that schedule, she might own Blackthorn Manor. But she could not prove ownership of anything else. And if the deadline passed, Charles could claim the entire trust. A knock echoed through the house. Finch looked toward the hall. No visitor could have reached Blackthorn accidentally in that weather. Eleanor folded the trust papers and hid them beneath her coat. The knock came again. 3 precise strikes. She opened the front door. A man stood outside beside a black carriage. He was perhaps 50, immaculately dressed, with silver spectacles and a leather document case tucked beneath one arm. Miss Eleanor Vale? Yes. Arthur Pembroke. Solicitor. Eleanor did not invite him inside. Whose solicitor? A faint smile. Your family's. My family appears to have several definitions. Pembroke removed an envelope. I have been instructed to deliver this personally. Eleanor opened it. The first line was enough. Notice of sale. Blackthorn Manor was scheduled for public auction in 8 days. She looked up. This property belongs to me. According to the deed transferred by Mrs. Vale, yes. Then she cannot sell it. She is not. Pembroke adjusted his spectacles. The creditors are. Eleanor felt the first genuine stab of fear. What creditors? Blackthorn carries substantial secured debts. How substantial? Approximately 11,000 pounds. Eleanor almost laughed. She possessed 32. That is impossible. Unfortunately not. Who borrowed against the estate? Pembroke hesitated. Your father. Finch appeared behind Eleanor. That's a lie. Pembroke's eyes moved toward him. Mr. Finch. You know damn well Edmund never borrowed against Blackthorn. I merely carry the documents. Then show us. Pembroke opened his case. Inside were mortgage papers bearing Edmund Vale's signature. Eleanor studied them. The signature looked genuine. The seal looked genuine. The dates stretched across 7 years. If these are real, she said, why would Margaret give me the estate? Pembroke closed the case. That is a question for Mrs. Vale. You came 60 miles in winter just to tell me the property will be sold. I came because there is one method by which the sale may be suspended. Eleanor waited. Pay the debt? No. Pembroke looked directly at her. Renounce the property. Finch swore under his breath. Pembroke continued calmly. If you sign Blackthorn back to the Vale estate, Mrs. Vale has agreed to assume its obligations. And I leave with nothing. You leave without 11,000 pounds of debt. Everything became clear. Margaret had not expected Eleanor to remain. She expected Blackthorn to frighten her. Then the debts would force her to surrender it voluntarily. Why not simply keep Blackthorn in the first place? Pembroke's expression gave away nothing. I cannot answer that. But Eleanor could. Because Margaret could not simply take property protected by Beatrice's trust. Eleanor had to surrender it, voluntarily. How long do I have? The auction occurs in 8 days. I suggest deciding sooner. Eleanor folded the notice. No. Pembroke blinked. I beg your pardon? I will not sign. Miss Vale, perhaps you do not appreciate. I understand perfectly. She stepped backward. You may tell Margaret that Blackthorn remains mine. For the first time, Pembroke's calm expression slipped. Only slightly. But Eleanor saw it. She will be disappointed. I suspect she will survive. Pembroke returned to his carriage. Before stepping inside, he looked back. Your father once believed stubbornness could defeat arithmetic. Eleanor's hand tightened around the door. And? It cost him dearly. The carriage disappeared down the avenue. Finch waited until it vanished. He knows. Yes. About the trust? At least part of it. Eleanor pulled out the mortgage documents she had quietly taken while Pembroke was closing his case. Finch stared at her. You stole those. I borrowed one. She carried it to the kitchen. For 20 minutes, Eleanor compared Edmund's mortgage signature with entries in Finch's visitor ledger. Then she noticed it. One mortgage was supposedly signed at Blackthorn on October 17, 1881. Finch's ledger showed Edmund had not been there. He had arrived 4 days later. The mortgage had been forged. Eleanor checked another, then another. 3 documents, 3 dates, all impossible. Finch whispered, Margaret? Perhaps. Eleanor held the page near the window. Something unusual appeared beneath the ink. A faint impression, as though another sheet had once been placed above it while someone wrote. She rubbed charcoal lightly across the paper. Letters emerged. Not Edmund's signature. A sentence. Asset schedule transferred to Wren & Sons, Ashbourne, Vault 17. Finch stared. Wren & Sons was a bank. Was? Closed 12 years ago. What happened to its records? The building still stands. Who owns it? Finch's expression darkened. Charles Vale. Eleanor looked toward the snowy road. 6 days remained. And somewhere inside a bank owned by the man who stood to inherit everything was the document that could prove what Blackthorn was truly worth. Ashbourne looked different beneath winter snow. The market square was almost empty when Eleanor and Finch arrived shortly before noon, their hired cart rattling over frozen stones. Wren & Sons stood on the eastern side of the square. The bank had been closed for 12 years, but the building remained imposing. 3 stories of dark stone, iron-barred windows, and the weathered outline of its former name above the entrance. A newer brass plaque had been fixed beside the door. Property of Charles Vale. Finch read it and muttered, "Convenient." Eleanor stepped down from the cart. Too convenient. The front door was locked. She knocked anyway. No answer. Finch walked around the side of the building. Windows are shuttered. Eleanor looked toward the neighboring shops. A butcher watched them from across the street. A woman carrying bread slowed when she saw Eleanor standing before the old bank. People knew something. Small towns always did. Eleanor crossed the square and entered the butcher's shop. A broad man behind the counter looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for whoever keeps the keys to Wren & Sons." His expression changed immediately. "That place is closed." "I noticed." "Then you'll know nobody goes in." "Someone must." The butcher looked toward the bank through his window. "Mr. Vale has a man check it once a month." "What man?" He hesitated. "Daniel Mercer." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Finch. "Of course. When was he last here?" "Yesterday." That was worse than she expected. "What did he do?" The butcher wiped his hands on his apron. "Carried out 2 boxes." Finch swore. Eleanor leaned closer. "What kind of boxes?" "Record boxes. Old ones." "Where did he take them?" "Vale Warehouse, I suppose." "Where is that?" "North Road, near the railway yard." Eleanor turned to leave, then stopped. "One more thing. Does the name Vault 17 mean anything to you?" The butcher went still. "You really are Edmund Vale's daughter." Eleanor looked back. "You knew my father?" "Everybody did." The man lowered his voice. "He came asking about Vault 17 years ago." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing." "Why?" "Because the last man who helped him lost his shop." Silence settled over the room. "Who?" The butcher glanced toward the street before answering. "Samuel Wren." "The banker?" "His son." Eleanor frowned. "I thought the bank simply failed." "That's the official story." "What happened?" "Samuel discovered something in the records. 2 weeks later, Wren & Sons was insolvent. His creditors appeared from nowhere. By spring, Charles Vale owned the building." Eleanor felt the pattern tightening around her. "What happened to Samuel?" "Left Ashbourne." "Where did he go?" "No one knows." Finch stepped closer. "Is Vault 17 inside?" The butcher nodded. "Basement level." Eleanor looked again toward the old bank. If Mercer had been there yesterday, there was little chance the asset schedule still remained untouched. But her father had searched for years. She could not walk away now. They returned to the bank. Finch examined the rear door. "I could force this." "And give Charles a reason to have us arrested?" "You have another idea?" Eleanor looked upward. A narrow window on the second floor had been left slightly open. 20 minutes later, Finch was standing beneath it, while Eleanor climbed an old drainage pipe. "This is an exceptionally poor idea," he called quietly. "You said that about the chapel. And I was correct then, too." She reached the window. The frame groaned as she pushed it upward. Dust filled the room beyond. Eleanor climbed inside. The old bank smelled of paper, damp stone, and abandonment. Rows of desks remained beneath sheets. Ink bottles sat dry beside forgotten ledgers. She descended the staircase and unlocked the rear door for Finch. Together they found the basement. A corridor stretched beneath the building. Iron vault doors lined both sides. Numbers had been painted above them. 9, 11, 14, 16, then 17. The door stood open. Eleanor's heart sank. Inside, shelves had been emptied. Papers covered the floor. A broken wooden crate lay in one corner. Mercer had already searched it. Finch picked up a torn ledger. "We're too late." Eleanor entered anyway. She examined everything. The shelving, the floor, the walls. Nothing. Then she noticed scratches beside the lowest shelf, parallel marks, as if the shelf had been moved repeatedly. "Help me." Together they dragged it away from the wall. Behind it was a narrow iron compartment, locked. Finch stared. That wasn't part of the original vault. Eleanor tried the handle. No movement. She searched the floor. Among the scattered papers was a small brass key. Too obvious. She tried it. The lock clicked. Inside lay a single leather case. Eleanor opened it. Empty. Her stomach dropped. Then she saw writing on the inside of the lid. Her father's handwriting. If Margaret finds this first, she will destroy it. I have moved the schedule to where Beatrice began. Follow the 3 black thorns. Finch read over her shoulder. Where Beatrice began? The hidden room? No? Eleanor remembered the letter. Begin beneath the chapel floor. But Beatrice had hidden the trust there. That was not where she began. Eleanor examined the leather case again. 3 small black thorn branches had been embossed into one corner. She had seen that symbol before, not in the chapel, in Blackthorn Manor, on the fireplace inside Beatrice's sealed room. Then footsteps sounded above them. Finch extinguished the lamp. A key turned in the bank's front door. Men entered. More than one. Eleanor heard Daniel Mercer's voice. Check the basement first. Finch whispered, They know we're here. Another voice answered Mercer. Eleanor recognized it immediately. Charles. Her stepbrother had come to Ashbourne himself, and judging by the sound of the bolt sliding across the basement door, he had no intention of allowing Eleanor to leave with what she had discovered. Charles's footsteps stopped at the top of the basement stairs. Eleanor stood motionless inside Vault 17. Finch was beside her, one hand pressed against the cold iron wall. Outside, Daniel Mercer tried the basement door. It's bolted from this side, he said. Charles answered, Then break it. Eleanor looked around the vault. One entrance. No windows. No second passage. Finch leaned close. If they find us here, Charles will claim we broke into his property. We did. That will not improve matters. The first blow struck the basement door. Wood cracked. Eleanor looked again at her father's message. Follow the 3 black thorns. Then she noticed something she had missed. The 3 thorn symbols embossed into the leather case were not identical. The first pointed upward. The second pointed left. The third pointed downward. Directions. She ran her fingers over the back of the compartment. Stone, iron, wood. Then, beneath the lowest shelf, she found a narrow seam. Finch. He crouched. Together, they pushed. A panel shifted inward. Behind it was a passage barely 3 feet high. Finch stared. Banks do not usually have tunnels. Apparently this one did. The basement door cracked again. Eleanor crawled inside. Finch followed and pulled the panel shut behind them. Darkness swallowed them. They moved on hands and knees through damp stone until the tunnel widened enough to stand. The air smelled of earth and rust. After perhaps 50 yards, they reached an iron ladder. Eleanor climbed first. A wooden hatch resisted above her. She pushed. Cold daylight spilled down. They emerged inside an abandoned warehouse near the railway yard. Finch laughed once. Wren & Sons moved money without using the street. Or records. Eleanor brushed dust from her coat. Through a broken window, she could see the old bank across the roofs. Charles and Mercer would discover the empty vault soon. They had minutes. We returned to Blackthorn. Finch nodded, but Eleanor hesitated. The butcher had said Mercer carried 2 boxes from the bank to a Vale warehouse, and they were now standing inside one. She turned. Rows of shelves filled the building. Most were empty. At the far end stood several wooden crates marked with dates. Then she saw 2 newer boxes beside a locked office. No dust. Mercer's boxes. Eleanor crossed the floor. Finch caught her sleeve. We should leave. After coming this far? Being brave and being foolish are neighbors. Then today, they may share a house. She broke the first box open with an iron hook. Bank ledgers, mortgage records, property transfers. Nothing that immediately mentioned Blackthorn. The second box contained correspondence. Eleanor searched rapidly. Then she found a bundle tied with red cord. The first letter was addressed to Charles. Dated only 3 months earlier, she opened it. The letter had been written by Arthur Pembroke. Eleanor read aloud. The female succession clause remains enforceable, provided Miss Eleanor Vale takes possession before the 40th anniversary. Finch stared. So they knew. Eleanor continued. If she voluntarily relinquishes the manor before that date, the trust will pass without challenge to Mr. Charles Vale. Everything Margaret had done suddenly made perfect sense. Give Eleanor the manor, reveal the debts, terrify her, force her to surrender it. Then Charles inherits the Blackthorn Trust legally. Not theft, not forgery, a voluntary transfer. Finch said, Your stepmother planned this. Yes. But why risk sending you to Blackthorn at all? Because the trust required me to take possession. Eleanor read further. Pembroke had underlined one sentence. Failure to place the female heir in possession before the deadline may invite judicial review of prior transfers. Margaret needed Eleanor inside Blackthorn, just long enough to satisfy the trust. Then she needed her frightened enough to leave. The ruined manor had never been a gift. It was a legal trap. A shout came from outside the warehouse. Mercer, they came through here. Finch grabbed the bundle. Now we leave. They slipped through a rear door and crossed the railway yard. A train stood beside the platform, steam pouring around its wheels. Eleanor and Finch moved between freight wagons just as Mercer appeared at the warehouse entrance. There. They ran. Eleanor's boots slipped on frozen gravel. Finch pulled her upright. A whistle screamed. The train began moving. They crossed behind the final carriage and disappeared into a narrow lane. Mercer reached the crossing seconds later, but was forced to stop as the train passed between them. Eleanor looked back through the steam. Charles stood beside him. He did not shout. He did not chase. He simply watched her. That frightened Eleanor more. They reached Blackthorn near dusk. Eleanor went directly to Beatrice's hidden room. The fireplace was carved from black marble. At first she saw only flowers and vines. Then Finch raised the lamp. There, 3 blackthorn branches, identical to those on her father's leather case. Eleanor touched the first. Nothing. The second. Nothing. The third moved beneath her fingers. A section of carving depressed with a soft click. Inside the fireplace, something shifted. Finch stepped back. A narrow stone panel opened beside the hearth. Behind it was a cavity. Inside lay a wooden box. Eleanor lifted it onto the desk. The box contained no asset schedule, only 3 objects: a small silver key, a faded photograph of a young woman standing beside Blackthorn Manor, and a folded map. Eleanor stared at the photograph. The woman was Beatrice, but she was not alone. Beside her stood another woman, younger, holding an infant. On the back, Beatrice had written, Anna Harcourt and her daughter. The truth must pass through her. Eleanor frowned. I have never heard of Anna Harcourt. Finch had gone silent. She looked at him. You know that name. He sat slowly. Anna was Beatrice's younger sister. My grandmother had a sister? Yes. What happened to her? Finch looked at the child in the photograph. She disappeared the same winter Beatrice did. Eleanor unfolded the map. It showed Blackthorn Manor and the surrounding estate. A black line ran from the west wing through the gardens and toward an old family cemetery beyond the trees. At the end were 3 words, Harcourt Family Vault. Beside them, her father had later added another note. The schedule is not the secret, the bloodline is. Eleanor read it twice. What bloodline? Finch did not answer. His face had become strangely pale. Finch. He looked at her. There is something your father made me promise never to tell you unless you found this room yourself. Eleanor's heartbeat slowed. Tell me now. Finch looked at the photograph again, then at Eleanor. Edmund Vale was your father in every way that mattered. The room seemed to tilt. But, Finch swallowed. But he was not the man who gave you the Harcourt blood. Eleanor stared at him. What are you saying? Before Finch could answer, a sound came from the entrance hall. A carriage, then another. Doors slammed outside. Several men were approaching the house. Eleanor went to the window. Charles had returned, but this time he had not brought only Mercer. Beside him stood Arthur Pembroke, 2 constables, and Margaret Vale. Her stepmother looked up toward the west wing window as though she knew exactly where Eleanor was standing. Finch whispered, "They've come for the papers." Eleanor folded the map and slipped it inside her coat. No. She watched Margaret climb the front steps. "They've come to make certain I never reach that family vault." Margaret did not knock. The front doors opened below with enough force to echo through the west wing. Eleanor slipped the photograph, map, and silver key inside the lining of her coat. Finch gathered the loose papers from Beatrice's desk. "You cannot let them find those." "Where?" He looked around the sealed room, then toward the fireplace. "Back where they came from." Eleanor shook her head. "If Mercer found the bank compartment, he may know about this one too." Footsteps sounded on the main staircase. Several men. Close. Finch opened a narrow cabinet beside the bookcase. Its shelves were shallow, but the back panel sounded hollow when he struck it. He pulled. The panel swung inward. "Servant's passage." "You knew about this." "I knew Blackthorn had them, not where all of them led." They slipped inside seconds before voices reached the corridor. Finch closed the panel. Darkness surrounded them. Through a crack in the wood, Eleanor could see part of Beatrice's room. Margaret entered first. She wore black mourning clothes, though there was nothing mournful in her expression. Charles followed. Then Pembroke. Daniel Mercer remained at the door. Margaret looked around the room. "So," Charles stared at the desk. "She found it." Margaret's face tightened. "I told you the wall should have been reinforced." Eleanor felt anger flare through her. They had known, not suspected, known. Pembroke entered more carefully. "Where is she?" Mercer answered. "Her coat was downstairs." "She is in the house." Margaret walked to the desk. Her gloved fingers touched the dust where the letters had been disturbed. She opened Beatrice's correspondence. Charles swore. "Then this is over." "No," Margaret said. "Not yet." Pembroke closed the door behind them. "What exactly are you proposing?" Margaret turned. "That depends on what she found." Charles glanced toward Mercer. "Search the room." Mercer began opening drawers. Eleanor held her breath. Beside her, Finch remained perfectly still. Margaret walked to the green coat hanging beside the fireplace. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. Something in her face changed. Not fear, recognition. "You have been here before," Pembroke said. Margaret looked at him sharply. He smiled faintly. "You never told me." "I did not consider it relevant." "When?" "A long time ago." "How long?" Margaret ignored the question. Eleanor watched her. Then she understood. Margaret had known Beatrice. That seemed impossible. Beatrice disappeared in 1846. Margaret was perhaps 50. She would have been a child, but children remembered. Mercer pulled a drawer free from the desk. "Nothing." Charles turned toward the fireplace. "What about the compartment?" Eleanor's blood chilled. Mercer pressed the third thorn. The stone panel opened. Empty. Margaret stared. She found that too. Charles slammed his fist against the mantel. "Then she has the map." Pembroke's expression sharpened. "What map?" Margaret said nothing. "What map, Mrs. Vale?" Charles answered before she could stop him. "The Harcourt vault." Pembroke stepped back. "You told me there was no surviving route to it. There wasn't supposed to be. And if she reaches it?" Margaret looked directly at Charles. "Then everything becomes more difficult." Not impossible, more difficult. That distinction mattered. Eleanor leaned closer to the crack. Pembroke lowered his voice. "If the original schedule is there, the debts against Blackthorn collapse. Every mortgage drawn against trust property could be challenged. Charles said, "We know." Pembroke continued, "And if Beatrice's final declaration survived," Margaret turned on him. "Enough." Silence. Eleanor felt Finch shift beside her. Final declaration. Something beyond the asset schedule. Something they feared even more. Mercer searched behind the curtains. "We should find the girl." Margaret nodded, quietly. Charles looked toward the door. "The constables are downstairs. They are here to enforce the debt order. Nothing more." "And if Eleanor refuses?" Margaret's expression hardened. "She has refused before." Charles smiled. Not pleasantly. "Then perhaps Blackthorn really is unsafe." Eleanor understood the implication. So did Finch. He touched her sleeve and gestured farther down the passage. They moved silently away. The hidden corridor descended inside the wall. At the bottom, they emerged behind shelves in the old pantry. From there, Eleanor could hear the constables in the entrance hall. Leaving through the front was impossible. The kitchens opened toward the rear courtyard. They slipped outside into the snow. Finch led her toward the stables. "What did your father tell you about Anna Harcourt?" Eleanor whispered. "Not here. We may not have another chance." He stopped beside the stable wall. His breath clouded in the frozen air. "Your father discovered Anna's name in parish records." "What records?" "Births." Eleanor stared at him. "Whose birth?" Finch looked at her. "Yours." For several seconds, she did not understand. "My mother's name was Catherine Vale." "Yes." "Catherine Harcourt Vale?" "No." Finch spoke carefully. "Your mother was Catherine Reed before she married Edmund." Eleanor knew that. But Catherine's mother, he hesitated, was Anna Harcourt's daughter, the child in the photograph. Eleanor's eyes moved toward the west wing. Beatrice, Anna, two sisters, two branches of the same family. My grandmother through my mother. Yes. Was the infant in that photograph? Yes. Eleanor struggled to breathe. That meant she carried Harcourt blood from both sides of the history Margaret had tried to erase. But why hide it? Because Anna's daughter was declared dead. Eleanor stared. She wasn't. No. What happened? Anna fled Blackthorn with the child, before Beatrice disappeared. Someone helped them change names. Who? Samuel Wren's father. The bank. Again, everything led back to Wren and Sons. Finch continued. Your father discovered the truth years later. He married Catherine before he knew. When he learned who her mother really was, he realized something far worse. What? Finch looked toward the manor. Well, if Beatrice had no surviving daughter, then the trust passed through the granddaughter of her sister. Eleanor felt the answer before he spoke it. You. The inheritance was not merely being passed to her because someone chose her name. She was the legal heir by blood, perhaps the only heir. A horse whinnied inside the stable. Finch opened the door. We need to reach the Harcourt vault before Margaret does. Eleanor unfolded the map. The family cemetery lay nearly a mile north, beyond Blackthorn's abandoned orchard. They saddled two horses. As Eleanor tightened the girth, she noticed something nailed beneath the saddle rack. A small envelope. Fresh. Her name was written across it. Not old ink. Recent. She tore it open. Inside was a single sentence. Do not trust Finch. Ask him who sealed Beatrice inside the West Wing. Eleanor slowly raised her eyes. Finch was standing 20 feet away, watching her. What does it say? He asked. She folded the note. Nothing useful. For the first time since arriving at Blackthorn, she lied to him. They rode north through the snow. The cemetery appeared near dusk. A rusted iron gate leaned between two stone pillars. Beyond it stood weathered headstones and a low mausoleum covered in black ivy. Above the entrance were 3 carved thorn branches. The Harcourt vault. Eleanor dismounted. Finch followed. She removed the silver key. It fitted the lock. But before she turned it, she looked at him. Who sealed Beatrice's room? Finch froze. Eleanor watched every change in his face. The old man closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the guilt was unmistakable. My father laid the bricks. Eleanor said nothing. And I carried them to him. The key remained in her hand. You told me you were 16. I was. Why? Because we were ordered to. By my grandfather? Finch shook his head. No. Then who? He looked toward the manor in the distance. Beatrice herself. Eleanor stared at him. She ordered you to brick her room shut? Yes. After she disappeared. Finch's voice dropped. No. Before. Eleanor felt cold move through her that had nothing to do with winter. Why would she seal her own room? Because she knew someone was coming for her papers. Who? Finch looked at her. Margaret's father. The answer rearranged everything. Margaret's family had been involved long before she married Edmund Vale. Finch continued. Beatrice believed she could escape through the servants' passage. My father sealed the outer wall to make everyone think the room had been abandoned. But she didn't escape. Finch looked down. No. What happened? I never knew. Eleanor gripped the silver key. Then perhaps she left the answer here. She turned it. The lock opened. Inside the Harcourt vault, stone shelves held the remains of generations. At the far end stood a small iron chest. 3 black thorns had been engraved into its lid. Eleanor approached. The silver key opened that lock too. Inside were documents wrapped in oilcloth. She removed the first bundle. Schedule of assets. Blackthorn Trust. They had found it. Finch exhaled. But Eleanor barely noticed. Beneath the schedule lay another document. A sealed declaration signed by Beatrice Harcourt Vale. The final declaration Pembroke feared. Eleanor broke the seal. The first paragraph confirmed the trust. The second named Anna and her descendants as successors. Then came the third. Eleanor stopped reading. Finch saw her expression. What is it? She read the line again. Beatrice had accused 3 men of systematically stealing property from the Harcourt estate. Her husband, a banker, and a solicitor named Jonathan Mercer. Eleanor looked up. Mercer. Finch's face changed. Daniel's grandfather. A sound came from outside. Snow crunching beneath boots. Many boots. Eleanor turned toward the entrance. Charles's voice came through the open vault door. You really should have signed the papers, Eleanor. Mercer stepped into view behind him. A pistol rested in his hand. Margaret followed last. She looked at the open chest, then at Beatrice's declaration in Eleanor's hands. For the first time since Eleanor had known her, Margaret Vale looked genuinely frightened. Give me that document. Eleanor held it tighter. No. Margaret's fear disappeared. Then you are about to learn why Beatrice never made it out of Blackthorn. For a moment, no one moved. Snow drifted through the open entrance of the Harcourt vault. Daniel Mercer stood beside Charles with the pistol angled toward the floor, but Eleanor had no doubt how quickly he could raise it. Margaret stepped forward. Give me the declaration. Eleanor folded the document once. No. Charles laughed softly. You are standing in a cemetery with nowhere to go. I noticed. You have the schedule. You know what Blackthorn contains. Take enough money to live comfortably and leave. Eleanor looked at him. You forged my father's debts. Charles's smile disappeared. You cannot prove that. I have the dates. Dates prove nothing. And Pembroke's letters? Margaret's eyes sharpened. Charles looked at her. What letters? That was interesting. Eleanor continued. The ones explaining exactly why you needed me to take possession before forcing me to surrender Blackthorn. Charles turned toward his mother. You said those were destroyed. Margaret did not answer. A crack opened between them. Small, but useful. Eleanor looked at Mercer. And your grandfather's name is in Beatrice's declaration. Mercer's face hardened. Old accusations. Accusations supported by property transfers, bank records, and the trust schedule. Documents can disappear. Finch stepped in front of Eleanor. Mercer raised the pistol. Move. No. Thomas. Finch stared at him. I carried bricks for your grandfather's crime once. Mercer's jaw tightened. You carried bricks because you were a frightened stable boy, and I have regretted it for 40 years. Eleanor looked at Finch. Beatrice ordered the room sealed. Yes, but Margaret said she never escaped. Finch's eyes remained on Mercer. She almost did. Margaret stepped forward. Do not. Finch ignored her. The servants' passage led from Beatrice's room to the pantry. From there, she intended to reach the chapel and take the trust documents. Eleanor remembered the empty shelves beneath the chapel. What stopped her? Finch looked at Margaret. Your father. Margaret's face went white. Charles frowned. My grandfather? Henry Ashcroft. Finch nodded. He had been helping Lord Vale move Harcourt properties into false accounts. Jonathan Mercer prepared the transfers. Wren's bank handled the money. Margaret's voice was cold. You were a child. You understood nothing. I understood enough to know Beatrice was terrified. Finch continued. Her husband discovered she intended to expose them. She sent Anna away first with the child. Eleanor thought of the photograph. Anna Harcourt, her infant daughter, her own maternal bloodline. Finch's voice lowered. Then Beatrice tried to leave. What happened? Eleanor asked. Henry Ashcroft caught her in the passage. Margaret shouted, Enough! The word echoed against the stone. Everyone fell silent. Eleanor looked at her stepmother. You knew. Margaret's eyes met hers. I knew what my father told me. What did he tell you? That Beatrice was unstable. That she intended to ruin 3 families because she imagined theft where there was only business. Finch shook his head. Lies. Margaret ignored him. My father spent his life repairing the damage caused by that woman. By hiding it? By protecting us. From what? Margaret looked at the declaration in Eleanor's hand. From losing everything. There it was. Not denial. Eleanor felt the last uncertainty disappear. Blackthorn was stolen. Margaret said nothing. So were the farms. Silence. The accounts. Silence. The mineral rights. Charles stepped forward. None of that matters now. It matters to the families who lost them. They are dead. Their children aren't. Charles's expression changed. For the first time, Eleanor understood the true danger of the asset schedule. It did not merely make her wealthy. It identified every property that had been taken, every fraudulent transfer, every family that might still have a claim. Blackthorn's fortune could become evidence against the entire Vale Ashcroft network. Margaret spoke slowly. Eleanor, listen to me carefully. If you take those papers to court, you will not simply destroy Charles. Good. You will destroy dozens of families whose fortunes now depend upon transactions made 40 years ago. Then perhaps those fortunes were never theirs. Margaret stared at her. You sound exactly like Beatrice. Eleanor almost smiled. I'll take that as a compliment. Margaret's expression hardened. Daniel. Mercer lifted the pistol. Finch moved. He struck Mercer's wrist with his cane. The shot exploded inside the vault. Stone chips flew from the wall. Charles lunged toward Eleanor. She stepped aside. He slipped on the snow-covered floor and crashed into the iron chest. Margaret grabbed for the declaration. Eleanor pulled back. The paper tore. Half remained in Margaret's hand, half in Eleanor's. No. Margaret stared at the torn document. Mercer shoved Finch against the wall and raised the pistol again. Then another voice came from outside. Put it down. Everyone froze. A man stood at the entrance to the vault. Tall, gray-haired, wrapped in a dark traveling coat. He held a shotgun leveled at Mercer. Behind him were 2 more men from Ashbourne. The butcher was one of them. Eleanor did not recognize the other. Finch did. His mouth fell open. Samuel? The gray-haired man looked at him. It has been a long time, Thomas. Samuel Wren, the banker's son who had vanished years earlier. Mercer slowly lowered the pistol. Charles stared. You have no authority here. Samuel stepped inside. No. He looked at Eleanor. But I have evidence. From beneath his coat, he removed a thick ledger. The original Wren account book. Margaret stopped breathing. Samuel continued. My father copied every transaction before Henry Ashcroft forced the bank into insolvency. Charles looked toward the entrance. You expect anyone to believe a failed banker? Samuel smiled without humor. No. That's why I brought someone who does not need to believe me. The second man entered, Arthur Pembroke. Charles stared at him. Margaret whispered, What are you doing? Pembroke removed his spectacles. Protecting myself. You work for us. I worked for you. He looked at Eleanor. Miss Vale, I believe you have enough now to suspend every claim against Blackthorn. Margaret's face twisted. You coward. Pembroke ignored her. The debt instruments are fraudulent. The trust remains active. And if the schedule matches Wren's ledger, the assets can be traced. Eleanor looked down at the torn half of Beatrice's declaration. Margaret still held the other half. But it no longer mattered. Not completely. There were now witnesses, records, a banker, a solicitor, and the original trust schedule. Charles seemed to realize it too. He looked at his mother, then at Mercer, then toward the cemetery gates, and ran. Charles! Margaret shouted after him. He mounted the nearest horse and disappeared through the snow. Mercer followed seconds later. The butcher started after them. Samuel raised a hand. Let them go. Eleanor looked at him. Why? Because Charles is not running away. Samuel's expression darkened. He is running back to Blackthorn. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Why? Samuel pointed toward the asset schedule. There is one thing in Beatrice's records worth more to Charles than every farm and account combined. What? The original transfer register. Finch stared at him. I thought that was destroyed. So did Henry Ashcroft. Samuel looked at Eleanor. But your father found it. Where? Samuel answered. Inside Blackthorn Manor. Eleanor understood immediately. Charles was not fleeing. He was going back to destroy the one record capable of proving exactly how the fortune had been stolen. And somewhere in that ruined house, a 40-year-old secret was about to disappear forever. They reached Blackthorn after midnight. The manor stood black against the snow, except for one glow moving behind the west wing windows. Charles. Eleanor dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. Wait, Samuel called. She ignored him. Finch followed. The front door stood open. Cold air moved through the entrance hall. Mud and snow marked the floor. A trail led upstairs. Then came the smell. Smoke. Eleanor stopped. No. They ran. By the time they reached the western corridor, flames were already licking through the broken plaster around Beatrice's hidden room. Charles stood inside. He had dragged papers into the fireplace. Letters. Ledgers. Anything he could reach. Charles. He turned. His face looked almost peaceful. You should have taken the money. Eleanor rushed toward the desk. Half the letters were already burning. Charles kicked another bundle into the flames. Samuel entered behind her. Where is the register? Charles smiled. If you don't know, then perhaps Mother worried for nothing. Eleanor looked around the room. The green coat, the stopped clock, the desk. The 3 black thorns carved into the fireplace. Her father's words returned. The schedule is not the secret. The bloodline is. Samuel searched the desk. Finch pulled burning papers from the hearth. Eleanor stared at the wall. Her father had found the register. He had hidden it somewhere Beatrice had already used. Somewhere Margaret's family had overlooked for 40 years. Then Eleanor noticed the clock. 17 minutes past 9. It had remained stopped at that time since 1846. Why preserve a broken clock? She crossed the room and lifted it from the mantel. Too heavy. Far too heavy. Charles saw her. His expression changed. Put that down. Eleanor turned the clock over. 3 black thorns had been scratched into its wooden base. There, she smashed it against the edge of the desk. The casing split. A tightly rolled bundle of parchment fell out. Charles lunged. Eleanor reached it first. He grabbed her arm. Give it to me. No. He pulled harder. The fire spread to the curtains. Samuel seized Charles from behind. Charles threw him off and reached for Eleanor again. Finch stepped between them. Charles struck the old man across the face. Finch fell. Eleanor's anger broke through every trace of fear. She drove her shoulder into Charles and shoved him backward. He stumbled against the burning desk. Flames caught the sleeve of his coat. Charles screamed and tore it off. The ceiling groaned. Samuel shouted, "Out!" Eleanor grabbed the register. Finch tried to stand. She helped him. They staggered into the corridor as fire consumed Beatrice's room. Charles followed, then stopped. Something remained inside. He saw it, a small metal case beneath the desk. He turned back. "Leave it!" Eleanor shouted. Charles ignored her. He ran into the flames. A beam collapsed behind him. The doorway vanished in sparks. Margaret appeared at the far end of the corridor. She had arrived alone. "Charles." She rushed forward. Samuel caught her. "You cannot go in. My son is in there." Another section of ceiling fell. For several seconds, all they could hear was fire. Then Charles emerged through the smoke. His hands were burned. The metal case was pressed against his chest. He fell to his knees. Margaret ran to him. "What were you thinking?" Charles laughed weakly. "You said this was the only thing that mattered." He handed her the case. Eleanor stared. The register in her hands could prove fraudulent transfers. But whatever sat inside that case frightened Margaret more. Margaret opened it. Her face changed. Inside was a single sealed letter. Beatrice's handwriting covered the front. "To my daughter, if they tell you I am dead." Margaret stared at it. Eleanor whispered, "Beatrice had a daughter?" Samuel looked confused. She had no recorded child. Finch slowly got to his feet. His expression told Eleanor otherwise. "Thomas?" He looked at Margaret, then at the letter. There was a child. Margaret's eyes lifted. "No." Finch continued, "Born in this house." "No." Beatrice sent Anna away because she wanted someone to protect the infant. Margaret backed away. "Stop." Eleanor suddenly understood why Beatrice had sealed the room, why the bloodline mattered, why Margaret's father had spent his life destroying records. "Who was the child?" Eleanor asked. Finch's voice trembled. "A girl." Margaret turned toward him. "Do not say it." But Finch did. Elizabeth Ashcroft, Margaret's mother. Silence swallowed the corridor. Eleanor looked at Margaret. Margaret looked as though the burning manor had disappeared around her. "That is impossible." Finch shook his head. Henry Ashcroft did not steal Beatrice's daughter. His voice softened. He raised her. Eleanor felt the final pieces fall into place. Margaret was not merely connected to the Harcourt theft. She descended from Beatrice herself. And if that was true, Margaret had spent her entire life helping destroy the inheritance that legally belonged to her own bloodline. The floor beneath them cracked. Samuel shouted for everyone to move. They descended into the entrance hall as the west wing burned behind them. Outside, Margaret stood in the snow holding Beatrice's unopened letter. Her hands shook. For the first time, she looked not cruel, not calculating, only terrified. Eleanor stepped toward her. "Open it!" Margaret shook her head. "No." "Why?" "Because if Finch is telling the truth." She looked at Charles, then at the manor, then finally at Eleanor. "Then everything my father taught me about this family was a lie." Eleanor held the original transfer register against her chest. "That is exactly why you need to read it." Margaret stared at the seal, then broke it. Her eyes moved across the first lines. She stopped. Her face collapsed. Eleanor reached for the letter. Margaret did not resist. Beatrice had written only 2 pages, but the final sentence changed everything. If Elizabeth or her descendants ever return to Blackthorn, they are not my enemies. They are my heirs. The estate is to belong equally to my blood, wherever they may be found. Eleanor looked at Margaret. The woman who had tried to force her from Blackthorn was not merely her stepmother. Through Beatrice, they were family. And the fortune Charles had been willing to burn the manor to possess did not belong to either side alone. It belonged to both. But before Eleanor could speak, Samuel took the transfer register from her and opened the final page. His expression changed. There is one more problem. What? He turned the register toward them. The final transfer had been entered only 2 days before Edmund Vale died, and beside it was a signature none of them expected. Margaret Vale. Eleanor looked at her. Margaret's face went white. Samuel whispered, "This wasn't done 40 years ago." He pointed to the entry. Someone was still stealing from Blackthorn 3 weeks ago. Margaret stared at her own signature. For several seconds, she said nothing. Snow gathered along the shoulders of her black coat, while firelight flickered across the ruined west wing behind them. Charles sat against the stone wall of the manor, his burned hands wrapped in strips torn from Samuel Wren's shirt. Eleanor watched Margaret carefully. "You signed the transfer." Margaret finally looked up. "Yes." Charles turned toward her. "Mother, be quiet." Something in her voice silenced him instantly. Samuel held the register open. The entry transfers 3 Blackthorn securities into an account controlled by Charles Vale. Eleanor looked at Margaret. 3 weeks ago. Yes. After my father died? No. Margaret swallowed. 2 days before. The answer struck Eleanor harder than she expected. You were moving the trust while he was dying. Margaret closed her eyes. I believed the trust belonged to Charles. You knew about the female succession clause. I knew what Pembroke told me. That does not explain this. No. Margaret looked toward the burning manor. Nothing explains it well. For the first time, she did not sound like a woman preparing a defense, only someone exhausted from carrying one. My father raised me to believe the Harcourts had nearly destroyed our family. He told me Beatrice was unstable. He told me Blackthorn had been rescued by men strong enough to manage what women could not. Samuel gave a bitter laugh. Convenient philosophy for a thief. Margaret nodded. Yes. Eleanor had not expected that. Margaret continued. When Edmund began searching the old records, I thought grief had made him obsessive. Then he found evidence that my father had lied. And you helped hide it. At first. At first? Margaret looked down at Beatrice's letter. Your father showed me the trust 6 months ago. Eleanor stared. He knew? He knew enough. Then why didn't he tell me? Because he was trying to restore what had been taken before bringing you into it, Samuel asked. By moving the assets? Margaret shook her head. By tracing them. Charles suddenly struggled to stand. Stop talking. Margaret turned. No, Charles. You said we were protecting the family. I was protecting what I thought belonged to us. You signed those transfers. Yes. For me. Yes. Charles smiled desperately. Then none of this changes anything. Margaret looked at him for a long time. It changes everything. Charles's face tightened. Margaret continued. When Edmund discovered the Blackthorn Trust could pass to Eleanor, he wanted to acknowledge her claim immediately. Eleanor's throat tightened. And you stopped him? Yes. Why? Because I thought if you inherited Blackthorn, Charles would lose everything. Eleanor almost laughed from disbelief. So you gave me Blackthorn yourself? Margaret nodded. I needed you to take legal possession. Then frighten me into surrendering it. Yes. And the forged mortgages? Margaret looked toward Charles. Eleanor followed her gaze. Charles said nothing. Margaret's expression hardened. I authorized 1 false debt. Samuel's eyebrows rose. 1? The first. Why? To make Eleanor believe the estate was financially impossible. Eleanor looked at Charles. And the others? Margaret's silence answered. Charles backed away. I did what was necessary. Margaret stared at him. You forged Edmund's signature? He was dying. You forged your father's name? He was not my father. The words came out with such contempt that even Margaret recoiled. Charles continued. He spent his last years crawling through rotten houses and dead banks chasing ghosts. He was going to hand everything to her. He pointed at Eleanor. She was always the favorite. Eleanor shook her head. This was never about being favored. It was always about that. Charles laughed. You arrive with one suitcase, walk into a ruin, and suddenly everyone decides you are Beatrice reborn. No. Eleanor stepped toward him. I simply opened the door you were afraid of. Charles's expression twisted. He moved quickly. Before anyone could stop him, he seized the pistol Mercer had dropped near the cemetery and hidden beneath his coat. Margaret screamed. Charles raised it toward Eleanor. You should have left. A shot cracked across the snowy courtyard. Eleanor flinched, but Charles did not fire. His pistol fell from his hand. Samuel stood several yards away, smoke rising from his shotgun. He had fired into the snow beside Charles's feet. Next one will not be a warning. Charles froze. Moments later, the two constables who had followed Margaret from Ashbourne arrived at the manor. This time, Margaret did not order them to protect her son. She pointed toward Charles. Take him. Charles stared at her. Mother. Margaret did not look away. Take him. They did. By sunrise, the fire had consumed most of Blackthorn's west wing, but the main house remained standing. So did Beatrice's trust, and so did the evidence. Arthur Pembroke returned before noon with enough paper to cover the kitchen table. Samuel placed the original bank ledger beside the transfer register. The trust schedule was compared line by line. Land, bonds, farm rents, mineral leases, commercial properties, accounts accumulated across 4 decades. The total value stunned even Pembroke. Blackthorn had never been a worthless manor. It was the center of a fortune. But Eleanor no longer cared about the number. She cared about the names. Families whose land had been transferred. Tenants who had been charged rents they did not owe. Widows whose holdings had disappeared into false accounts. Businesses ruined so others could acquire them cheaply. Beatrice had recorded everything. Eleanor spent the next 3 months doing what no one in the Vale family expected. She gave much of it back. Properties obtained through fraudulent transfers were returned, where survivors could be identified. Debts manufactured against tenant families were cancelled. The remaining Blackthorn assets were placed into a new trust, not the Vale Trust, not the Harcourt Trust. The Blackthorn Trust remained, but Eleanor rewrote its purpose. The estate would maintain Blackthorn Manor, support the families harmed by the old fraud, and preserve the records that had nearly been destroyed. Margaret did not contest it. She testified instead. Her evidence, combined with Samuel's ledger and Pembroke's documents, exposed decades of fraudulent property transfers. Daniel Mercer disappeared before charges could be filed. Charles was not so fortunate. The forged mortgages alone were enough to ensure he would not return to Blackthorn for many years. Margaret left England the following spring. Before she departed, she came to the manor one final time. The west wing stood roofless, surrounded by scaffolding. Eleanor found her in Beatrice's old room, or what remained of it. Margaret held the green coat that had hung untouched for 40 years. I hated her, she said. Beatrice? My father taught me to. Eleanor stood beside her. Margaret looked toward the broken fireplace. It is strange to discover that the villain in every story you were told was the person trying to save you. Eleanor said nothing. Margaret folded the coat carefully. Will you rebuild this room? Yes. As it was? No. Margaret looked at her. Why? Because houses should not become tombs. Something almost like a smile crossed Margaret's face. She placed Beatrice's coat on the desk, Then she left. Eleanor never saw her again. By the following winter, Blackthorn Manor had changed. The roof was repaired. The eastern tower reopened. Children from the tenant cottages played in gardens that had once been dead. Samuel Wren established a small office in Ashbourne to help Eleanor trace the remaining claims. Finch refused retirement, despite Eleanor offering it repeatedly. "You would destroy this place without supervision," he told her. She let him believe that was why he stayed. And in the restored West Corridor, Eleanor made one decision that surprised everyone. She did not rebuild the brick wall. The doorway to Beatrice's room remained open. Above it, Eleanor placed a small wooden plaque. No family crest. No grand inscription. Only 5 words. Nothing true should stay buried. Years later, visitors would ask Eleanor why she had kept a ruined section of brick beside the doorway. She would sometimes tell them. Sometimes she would not. But she always remembered the night she first arrived at Blackthorn, with 32 pounds, 1 suitcase, and an inheritance everyone called worthless. Her stepmother had believed she was giving Eleanor a ruin. Instead, she had given her the one place capable of exposing 40 years of lies. A hidden room, a forgotten woman, a stolen bloodline, and an inheritance that had never truly been about money. Because what Eleanor found behind that sealed door was worth far more than the fortune buried inside Blackthorn. She found the truth. And unlike the manor, she would never allow anyone to wall it up again.